All right, continuing with angles here. So another way that you can name angles is by numbers. So if you see numbers here inside the angles, that doesn't mean that this angle is 1 degree, this angle is 2 degrees, there's no degree symbol. This is just angle 1, this is angle 2. But if you have two angles that have the same measure, like I do here, measure of angle 1 is 45 degrees, measure of angle 2 is 45 degrees, those two angles are said to be congruent. Just like if you have congruent segments, they have the same length, congruent angles have the same measure. So I could say the measure of angle 1 is equal to the measure of angle 2. Or since we have congruent angles, I can write a congruent statement. First of all, congruent angles could be two or more angles that have the same measure. I could have a third angle, angle 3, that also measures 45 degrees, and then all three of the angles would be congruent. But kind of like with segments, congruent segments, segment lengths, everything's pretty specific. The measure of angle 1 is equal to the measure of angle 2. I could also say or write a congruent statement. This is not a congruent statement, but this implies that the two angles are congruent. The congruent statement would be just angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Angles are congruent, their measures are equal. So this would be a correct congruent statement. Similar with segments as well. If you just have a little slash mark between two segments, that means those segments are congruent. I could use tick marks with angles as well. I could show that these two angles are congruent just by making a little arc between those two angles. Okay, that's one way that I could show that the angles are congruent. I could do something like this as well, making a little tick mark inside of the little angle as well. That shows that the two angles are congruent. Let's just say I have two other angles. I'm going to make them obtuse angles to make it kind of obvious. If I wanted to show that these two angles, I'm going to call them angles 3 and 4, were congruent with each other, but not necessarily congruent with angles 1 and 2, I could put two tick marks on the angles. This shows that angles 3 and 4 are congruent, but not necessarily congruent with angles 1 and 2.